Where the lines on the interstate, the dust on the back road. We're a Friday night football game, the lighters at a rock show. Where the night shift smoke break, high school heartache, driving with the windows down. Where the dance floors, church pews, suit and ties, tattoos, one big small town.
But that sounds vaguely familiar. It's from the first night of the Democratic National Convention. It was really the opening song of the kind of official televised portion of it. It's Mickey Guyton singing. We have a guest today. I think it might be our first ever guest who has a superpower. Carlos Lozada has a superpower. He reads. Now, you might say, well, I read. Yeah, well, you can probably go to the gym and lift weights, but you're not the Incredible Hulk, and you might jog, but you're not the Flash. And that's the distinction between the way you read and the way Carlos Lozada reads. Carlos Lozada reads everything. He reads the books we all read. He reads the books that we pretend to have read. He reads original documents which inform his understanding of other things that he reads. And that has all added up to, among other things, the Pulitzer Prize for Criticism in 2019. Carlos Lozada is now an opinion columnist and co-host of the weekly Matter of Opinion podcast for the New York Times. His new book is The Washington Book, How to Read Politics and Politicians. We're going to be talking to him about that book and actually about stuff that happens on Matter of Opinion, which I'm kind of addicted to. And we'll also obviously be talking about what happened last night at the convention. We'll probably have to tackle that fairly early. But Carlos Lozada, welcome back to our show. It's great to have you back again.
Thank you so much for having me.
So maybe just begin with the premise of the new book. Washington books come out all the time. Some of them are memoirs by politicians, or at least ostensibly memoirs by politicians. Some of them are books about politicians. You also include pretty broadly in here things like the 9/11 Commission report, which, by the way, is better written than a lot of the other books that we just talked about, I just referred to. But just say what it is.
Absolutely.
What is it you're mining these books for? What are you looking for that the average person doesn't think to look for?
Right. So thank you for that introduction, by the way. I love the idea of being the Incredible Hulk of reading. That sounds great to me. So I've been a journalist in Washington for nearly 25 years, and yet I don't, interview politicians or, develop sources deep inside government agencies. Instead, I read. I read the kind of books you discussed, memoirs, commission reports, special counsel reports, of which there have been many recently. And I read a lot of books by politicians. And usually when I do that, and when people find out that that's how I make a living, they give me this look somewhere between surprise and pity. And they say, thank you for reading all those books so that we don't have to read those books. The assumption behind that is that they're bad, right? That these books are ghost written, that they're self-serving, they're propaganda, that there's no reason to spend any time with them, and I think that critique is completely misguided. I think that in my experience of all these years spending time reading these sorts of books, I find that no matter how carefully politicians sanitize their experiences and their positions and their records, no matter how diligently they try to present themselves to us in the most electable and favorable light, they always end up revealing themselves. They tell us something about who they really are. Politicians can't help it. They love to talk about themselves. So in these books, again, often unwittingly, they expose their true fears, their insecurities, their ambitions. They tell on themselves. It's rarely the sexiest stuff. It's rarely the kind of 5 takeaways from Obama's new memoir kind of thing. It might be a throwaway line. It might be something that Barack Obama said to a low-level aide on a plane. It might be a line that Mike Pence omits from a moment when he's quoting Donald Trump in his memoir. It might be something Vladimir Putin says, when he first becomes the head of Russia, and then 25 years later when he's about to invade Ukraine. Once you read enough of these books, you find these moments, you find these little coincidences and contradictions that are extremely revealing about the people who run the country and run the world.
Right.
So that's why I read these sorts of books and pretty obsessively, and why I write about them.
We should say, first of all, that all three of the examples you just gave were not fanciful. Those are they're, I believe, all in the book. That you
Yes,
just,
they are.
and so we'll go to one of them in just a second. But I want to say before that, sometimes they are sexy details, and you almost can't imagine what the person could possibly have been thinking. Somewhere on some planet, Kristi Noem got the idea that it would be good to put in a book about something about a puppy she shot, and I think it was a goat too. It was like
A goat as well.
yes, they were the puppies and goats are like stacked up like cordwood in this gravel pit, and you read that and you think, what could this person possibly have been thinking? It's the opposite of the over sanitized memoir.
Yes, you're completely right. And I wasn't planning on reading Kristi Noem's memoir when my plan was to kind of be ready to see who Trump might pick as his VP nominee this time around. She was one of the people considered to be in the mix. And so I just said, okay, whoever it is, hopefully that person will have published a book and I can just read that.
Did you ever get your wish on that? Anyway, continue.
Fortunately, JD Vance is, his whole claim to fame is in part based on a book. But with Kristi Noem, what happened is that once the story broke of the poor dog Cricket, I realized, okay, I have to read this. Like a lot of my colleagues were saying, "Are you going to read Kristi Noem's book now?" So I sort of had no choice. And here's what's great about it, right? At first I thought, well, like everyone's covered this to death. What am I going to add to the conversation now that everyone knows the story of Cricket and the goat? And for those of you who were sort of under a rock, this is a story,
or in a gravel pit. They might have been in
or
a different gravel
in that same gravel pit. But what happened there is, years ago she had organized this hunt for some fancy friends, and this dog Cricket had sort of ruined the hunt by getting out of ahead of the other hunting dogs, and sort of scaring away all the pheasant birds they were trying to shoot or something. And that later on the way home, Cricket jumped out of her truck and massacred all these chickens belonging to a neighbor. So Kristi Noem was very upset. This is long before she was governor of South Dakota. She was very upset, and she thought this dog is untrainable. So she dragged the dog off to a gravel pit and shot it. Then on her way back, she realized, there's this goat over here who we've never liked either. So I'm just going to kill the goat too. And so, but when I read the book, what was the most revealing thing to me is that, it wasn't just an anecdote that she probably shouldn't have included in the book. The reason she included it is because she was trying very hard to show how she makes difficult decisions. Mm-hmm. In fact, the whole story of Cricket and the goat, that story was in the middle of her chapter on national security and foreign policy, right? And so she's trying to show that she can be tough and that she can make the difficult decisions that other people don't want to make. But to my mind, they just made her seem reckless. They made me feel that she shouldn't be anywhere near the vice presidency. And so, reading the book, you see that broader context that, even on an issue that has gotten a ton of coverage, once you dive into the full volume, you see, not just what she said, but maybe why she thought it was a good idea to do it.
Right. I consider myself, certainly compared to you, very lazy in acquiring this knowledge. But I actually did know that thing about the decisions. And since we're talking about decisions, it's an easy segue from there to Kamala Harris's Truth Behold. This is a campaign biography, kind of written more for the 2020 campaign. I think I'm correct about that.
Yes.
And one of the things you really explore is this idea she has about false choices. She's kind of opposed to dichotomies. She's kind of desirous of saying, I can be sympathetic with people who have encountered abuse from the police and demand police accountability, but I can also be very sympathetic and supportive of the police and their mission. And you had some interesting thoughts, because you saw that as a pattern, right? Insisting that something was a false choice.
Yes, this is in the book called The Truths We Hold. which, as you said, it was a memoir that came out just before she launched her campaign for the 2020 presidency. So this came out in early 2019. Um, and, in some ways, it's a very conventional campaign memoir. Her family, her upbringing, her education, her work as a prosecutor, and her campaigns, for Attorney General of California and for the U.S. Senate. And one thing that comes up a lot in a lot of different contexts is this notion of false choices. She doesn't like getting pinned down. And for instance, she says you don't have to be, in favor of the police or in favor of holding the police accountable. I'm for both, right? You don't have to, she said that at a town hall meeting, a constituent once said that, oh, you care more about undocumented immigrants than you do about native-born citizens. And she said that's a false choice. I'm for both, and kind of once you notice that, you realize that she brings it up a lot. She even jokes in the book that her Senate staff made up these stress balls for everyone on her team with no false choices emblazoned on the stress balls, right? So this is a mantra of hers, and of course, in some ways, she's right. There are moments when there are false dichotomies. There are moments when politicians don't have to choose between A versus B, but politics in many ways is the art of choosing among competing priorities, of finding your place among competing trade-offs, right? And I wonder if part of the reason that she has had some difficulty carving out, a very defined role as VP has been in part for her unwillingness to kind of make those choices. And I think false choices captures that. And I'm looking forward to seeing if she talks about that in her acceptance speech when she accepts the Democratic nomination on Thursday, or how she talks about it on the campaign. Because once you're president, the only choices that come to you are very difficult ones. Any easy choices are done by someone else at a lower level, and simply calling them false choices in that moment isn't necessarily going to work.
There's also, I think, and you've already kind of alluded to it earlier, but back when I was writing a lot of magazine profiles, I used to sort of look for what I would call the rosebud moment. Because, at the end of Citizen, you find out what rosebud is, and a lot of dots suddenly connect. And I think you're really good at mining these biographies for rosebud moments. I actually thought, once I knew that Joe Biden's favorite movie was Chariots of Fire, I knew a lot, including I knew how hard it was going to be for him to step out of this race. Because obviously the figure of Eric Liddell had, a tremendous amount of meaning to him. But, you alluded to Obama and his aide. The aide is Reggie Love, and there's a story about a briefcase. Maybe sort of tell that story and then why it's a rosebud.
Yes. It's funny. This is not in one of Obama's many books. This is in a book by his former personal aide, Reggie Love. It's called Power Forward. And he had played basketball at Duke, and that's part of the play of the title. But he was Obama's aide during the first presidential campaign, and then in sort of the early period in the White House. And there's a moment when Reggie Love forgets to bring Obama's briefcase onto the plane when they're headed to some campaign event, a debate, I think, in the early Democratic primaries leading up to the 2008 election. And if you're the body man, right, if you're that personal aide, like, that's a huge no-no. Like, that is the job. That is, the old saying, like, you had one job, right? Like that was, in that moment, that was Reggie Love's one job. And so he's afraid he's going to get fired. But Obama, is magnanimous and forgives him. But he was pissed off about the missing bag. And then he says something to Reggie Love that became that kind of rosebud moment to me. He explains why he was pissed about the missing bag. Obama wanted to be seen carrying something off the plane, right? It projected a sort of kind of vigor that he wanted. And he said to Love, JFK carried his own bags. right? And that moment, that little line, which is not a huge deal in Reggie Love's book, um, to me was incredibly revealing, right? It tells me how thoughtfully, how carefully Obama cultivated his own public image, how he was, hyper conscious of how people perceived him, and how he was drawing on perhaps our most mythologized former president, um, to think about, the perceptions and myths and stories that would accrete around a future president, around himself, right? And so that little moment, JFK carried his own bags, told me so much about Barack Obama, and it's one of the lenses through which I always think about it now. He was obviously, we knew from Dreams from My Father, Audacity of Hope, from volume one of his presidential memoirs. He's not alone among U.S. presidents and caring a lot about how people think of him, right? But to the point that he wanted to be seen carrying bags off the plane, I just found that fascinating and memorable, and one of those moments that I live for when I'm reading these books.
Right. Even the word vigor, by the way, is a very JFK. Vigor is a very JFK term.
Well, that was my word. That was my word. Like he didn't,
yes,
the word he used, was that JFK carried his own bags, right? But I think that you're right. I mean, both very youthful,
yeah,
senators,
all you
barnstorming the country.
Yeah, switch out touch football for pick up basketball, and
yes.
You see what's happening here. All right,
you're right. You got that. Yeah.
Let's do a Rosebud moment from last night, or it might be, and it's not actually from Joe Biden's speech. It's from the preliminary speech by Ashley Biden, his daughter. We're going to play a little clip here, and then I'm going to have you kind of Carlos Lozada this clip. This is A2, Gene.
I have this memory. It's the eve of my 8th birthday. Dad is still in D.C., tending to urgent matters in the Senate. That night, as a surprise, Mom told me, Bo, and Hunter to get in the car. I remember pulling up to the Wilmington Amtrak station, riding up the escalator to the platform. The train stops, doors open, and Dad steps out. As soon as I saw him, I run down that platform and jump into his arms. Like magic, Mom brought out a cake, they sang happy birthday, and I blew out the candles. Dad hugged me, and he said that he had to get back to work. He crossed to the southbound train, and off he went to D.C. That was a snapshot of one moment, of one day, on this extraordinary journey of being Joe Biden's daughter.
So, to say the obvious, Carlos, this story can be processed in one of two different ways, but I'm interested to hear what you hear in it.
Well, I mean, the cynic's way is that, this is sort of the classic story of, the family man, politician, and, the beautiful memory from the daughter now introducing him. What leaps out to me, listening to this, is how much it captures so much of the story that Joe Biden. I mean, this is Ashley Biden telling the story of her dad, but it's really so much of the story that Biden has told about himself for so long, right? First of all, the train, right? Amtrak Joe, right? Joe Biden always coming home from Washington to be with his family. The poignancy of them all piling into the car to go meet him, to me immediately reminded me of the death of his first wife.
I had exactly the same thought
and daughter. Like in that moment, the instant, like when they all pile into the car to meet him at the train station, I immediately thought of that moment. And how after that, Joe kept coming home, kept going to the hospital all the time, taking the train to be with his boys, right? And so there was so much, it's a beautiful memory that Ashley Biden has in that moment, but it also connotes all the kind of freight and sadness of the Joe Biden story. There was one book, I hate that when this happens because you read so many books, you forget exactly where it comes from. But there was one book I read recently about Biden where one of his longtime aides says, Joe Biden is both um, the man, who has suffered the greatest misfortune of anyone I know, and also the luckiest man that I've ever met, right? And in the way that he's managed to live his life despite some of these great tragedies. And so that moment of joy, I find it almost telling that your reaction and my reaction was instinctively to remember a moment of great sadness.
Totally.
And so that's how I think of that's how I reacted, like in the moment last night, watching her introduce her father.
I mean, with a different set of goggles, that's the saddest birthday story ever. I mean, you got, I believe, 3 kids. I can't imagine that your the 8th birthday of any of those kids was observed by you hopping off of a train, letting them blow out some candles, then hopping
and then leaving
back
immediately,
on the train.
and then going back to work. Right. He had the kind of job where he can't just he can't just take the day, maybe, right? And but you're right. It's both a beautiful story and a very sad story of a man who, is constantly torn, right? Family, work, domestic life, political life, ambition. And yet, to Ashley, it seemed to be, at least the way she was presenting it seemed to be sort of a delightful memory that captured her father.
Oh yeah, everything's
public service and domestic life.
Everything's relative. I'm sure Eric Trump and Tiffany Trump were watching that and going, "Wow, he got on a train and he gave her 7 minutes on her birthday. I never got that." So yeah, it sort of depends on where you're coming from. We should make another point here, because I know it's one that you've made, which is right after that story, she talks about a tattoo that she has that has the phrase "Courage, dear heart." I think it relates to her brother, but she doesn't mention where it came from, which is kind of interesting. You noticed it, and you do know where it came from.
So now I know that you follow me on Twitter.
We know everything about you, Carlos. I mean, just settle into that, okay?
So I am an obsessive since childhood of the Chronicles of Narnia. And the moment she said "Courage, dear heart," it just popped into my head. That is Aslan, the lion, the sort of Christ figure lion of the Chronicles of Narnia, whispering this to Lucy, one of the 4 children who are the protagonist of the early books, at least. And this is about, and this is if I remember it correctly, I think it's in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, which is book 3 in the proper ordering of those books, by the way. The Narnia fanatics will know what I'm talking about. There is a chronological order, which is not the proper ordering of the books. But in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, there's a moment where there's this whisper that only Lucy can hear. And it's "Courage, dear heart." And it's about having courage in moments of great darkness, and remembering what it is that brings you joy, even among the greatest difficulties. And I can only imagine the loss of a brother like that. I've lost a sister at a young age, and it's devastating. It's one of those things that stays with you. And I had no idea that I remembered this particular quote, but the moment she said it, I knew that it was Aslan speaking to Lucy, and then I looked it up, and that was in fact correct. And I love that she just dropped it there, that she didn't tell us where it was from, didn't make a big deal out of it, just kind of said it. And I think some people might have thought that it was something that her father says to her, right? And it easily could have been sort of a family mantra in a moment of great darkness. But it spoke to me. I just love the fact that it was, assuming that this is the only reference to "Courage, dear heart." To me, it was very beautiful to evoke a very special relationship that exists in that book.
Absolutely. Well. And, actually, we're not going to talk about this now because last week we did almost a whole episode about it. But, J.D. Vance has been cited for his interest in Lord of the Rings. And actually, in one of the interviews, he mentions both Tolkien and C.S. Lewis as influences on him. So it's
well, they were buddies. So
it's officially a C.S. Lewis election right now. All right, we're going to take a little break. We're going to come back with more of Carlos Lozada after this.
What I'm working for is something more than dream. I don't think I'm here where it hurts. I'm just lucky to have the work. Sunday morning, I'm too tired to go to church, but I thank God for the world. I thank God for the world. Shall I tell her again how we started as friends, who would run into one another now and again?
I'm just playing that because James Taylor was supposed to sing last night at the convention. He got bumped like Matt Damon on a Jimmy Kimmel show. And we're talking to Carlos Lozada right now, opinion columnist and co-host of the weekly Matter of Opinion podcast for the New York Times, 2019 Pulitzer Prize winner for criticism. His new book, The Washington Book, How to Read Politics and Politicians, is available to you. Carlos, we should just quickly say, last night, I mean, I don't know how you processed this, but it seemed to me that on a night that was supposed to reinforce the idea that Joe Biden had made a dignified choice and deserved honor not only for his presidency and the things accomplished in the past 4 years, but also for the decision to step aside at the appropriate time, that they kind of undermined that. They didn't get him on until 11:30 Eastern time. His speech bled into the fifth hour of these kind of putative prime convention coverage. It was like, if you wanted to say that about that man, you have a strange way of doing it.
Yeah, it was, I guess I thought about it less in the sort of message it was sending, though clearly a lot of people did see it that way. I just couldn't believe it was taking so long. And my three young kids and my wife and I were all watching. We just wanted to get to bed. And there were so many speakers, and some of them really went on. I mean, I thought a lot of the speakers were terrific, but it really went on a long, long time. And if you want to give Joe Biden a send-off, doing it when the audience had probably diminished significantly was a little unfortunate.
Right. Let's talk about one of the other speakers, because this is absolutely in Carlos Lozada territory. We're going to hear Michigan State Senator Mallory McEnroe. She's speaking on the first night of the 2024 Democratic National Convention in what is apparently, I think, going to be a nightly occurrence where they do a little bit more of this. This is B1, Mr. Amatruda.
Hello! I'm Michigan State Senator Mallory McEnroe, and this is Project 2025.
And she's brandishing this kind of, Mr. Rogers prop-sized book. The Project 2025 is, I think, long, like 800 or 900 pages. It would have been a lot.
887.
Yes, it would have been a lot funnier if she'd pulled it out of one of those swag duffel bags. But you did, because you are you. You have actually ventured out onto that very dusty and frightening tundra of Project 2025 and then lived to tell the tale and wrote about it. And you did it before it was cool, too. I think it was back in February. So say a little bit about what you think of this and maybe how it either does or doesn't fit into an important narrative.
Sure. By the way, the version that she held up, I think, even though much bigger in terms of the size of the cover, it seemed a little thin compared to the actual book that I lugged around for a few weeks while I was reading. So this has become a huge part of the campaign, especially for the Democrats and for the Republicans trying to distance themselves from it. I became aware of Project 2025 last year. It was in the air. People who were writing stories about what a second Trump term might look like would refer to it. But it wasn't till someone whose book I had reviewed previously, someone I've never met personally, but just have kind of a weird social media relationship with, reached out to me and said, you really should read this. There are, really interesting things here. It's all laid out in great detail. And, you're the one person who I can imagine, like, plowing through it. So I tucked that in my pocket, and I finally decided to do it a few months later. I thought I was late to the party because it had been out, like it had been a PDF on the website of the Heritage Foundation for so long. And so I thought maybe I was coming to it late, but it turns out I was probably coming to it early, because only in the last few months has it become a sort of massive controversy. My takeaway from this is sort of threefold. First of all, it's a document that walks through every corner of the executive branch, like department by department, agency by agency, office by office, and says, like, here's what we want to do to it. Here's how we should get rid of it or change it. And it was put together by a bunch of different conservative thinkers and intellectuals, and a lot of people who staffed the first Trump term and probably want to be in a second. The three things I took away from it: first, its clear mandate is to flood the federal government with political appointees, with people who will be loyalists, who are evaluated for loyalty more than for expertise, and people who will be sort of unstinting about promoting the president's agenda. The second point is that this is particularly sort of alive in its treatment of the Justice Department. They want to turn the Department of Justice into a tool of the White House, into a tool of the president. And they say this overtly. Look, even litigation decisions need to be all consistent with the president's agenda. Remember, the president's in charge of the DOJ. The president hires the attorney general. Even the FBI director should be as aligned with the president's agenda as the head of any other agency. And so Trump is always complaining that the Department of Justice is weaponized against him. But at least in this document, it is set up to be weaponized by Trump himself, against whatever sort of rivals or enemies he chooses. And the third element that struck me from this book is that, we hear a lot about how people like Steve Bannon or other kind of like Trumpian thinkers or conservatives want to, quote, dismantle the administrative state, right? They want to take this behemoth of the federal government that's gotten too big and cut it down to size. If you read this book, I don't really think that's true. I don't think that's what at least the authors of this book want to do. They want to enlist the administrative state. They want to redirect it for their own purposes. There's a moment where one of the authors says that, look, of course we want to dismantle the administrative state, but really that's very hard to do. You need Congress to do its job. Until that happens, there's no reason for us not to use it for our purposes, right? Like in the meantime, right, until it gets dismantled, we can redirect it. And of course, in the meantime, in Washington, basically ends up meaning forever. So those are the things that I took away from this. The great sin of Project 2025 was putting it down in writing, right, preemptively, so that, it allowed people to critique it as a proxy for what Trump would do before Trump had even done anything, before he'd even won. And that ends up being part of why it's become such a controversy. Don't forget the number one rule of mafiosos is, don't write anything down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is like Ted Kaczynski publishing the Unabomber Manifesto before he started sending bombs out. You don't want to announce what your plans are, but yes. And so let me just,
I should say that Trump has kind of has disowned it, has made every effort to distance himself from it, says no one speaks for me except for me.
Yeah, and so that's an interesting segue to the question of platforms. And I'm not at the convention this year, but when I'm at conventions, at some point many times I'll run into my friend Bill Curry, who served in the Clinton White House and two-time gubernatorial nominee here in Connecticut. And he'll always come over to me and go, I'm talking to some people from the platform committee, and I just read some of the platform. And I always go, and I'm wrong. I'm going to preface this by saying I'm wrong. Look, nobody reads the platform. I guarantee you the nominees haven't read the platform. You're the only person who's interested in the platform around here. I mean, that was obviously wrong in 2000. I'm sure Al Gore read the entire platform. But it brings up a question. Here's another thing where something is committed to writing, which means that somebody has some serious intent about it. but I'm unpersuaded that it particularly rules the rhetoric of the campaign or even the decision. I don't think, elected presidents are particularly worried about whether what they're doing conforms to what's in the platform, but you may see that differently.
No, I tend to agree with you. I think that elected leaders are much more concerned about, specific campaign promises that they made that then they can be measured against, particularly if there's video of them making it, right? And there's not really video of any of these candidates reading the platform out loud. I think sometimes the platforms, I mean, this gets back to a thing I mentioned earlier, that sometimes what is omitted is as notable as what is included. And I believe it was the 2020 platform that wasn't really much of a platform, that said just, we enthusiastically endorse the Trump agenda, right? Like whatever that may be. And in some ways that was the most noticeable and the most telling and influential and purposeful version of a platform, because it just said, look, here we are, we're the party officials, and we are now a one-man party, right? And so I think something like that, to my mind, was probably the most noticeable, or not noticeable, the most revealing party platform that we've had in a long time, precisely because it got to the heart of it. It just said, we enthusiastically support, the America First agenda,
right.
Which means, however that is defined, sometimes at great variations, by Donald Trump.
So I can already tell we're going to run out of time way before I run out of questions. We got a little time before we go to a break here. You've written some interesting things about just individual words. Sometimes it's an 887-page book. Sometimes it's just a word or two, like still or again. But last night, were you surprised, having written an entire column about Trump's use of the word fight and Trump supporters' use of the word fight and what it seems to mean and how that meaning seems to mutate? Were you surprised by how many times fight got said last night on the first night of the Democratic National Convention? I started to be kind of, prickled by it every time it would come back up again. Obviously, when we fight, we win is sort of a toxin, TOCSIN toxin that they're using, but I don't know. It was surprising to me. Maybe it wasn't to you.
No, I definitely noticed it because I'd been struck by the word fight in Trump's rhetoric, and perhaps most historically resonant in the moment when, after being shot, he gets up, pumps his fist in the air, and that stage in Pennsylvania. And yells, fight, 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 right? And so, and I wrote about it then, as you said, like, what does Trump tend to mean when he uses the word fight? And I would say that there's one significant difference in how I think Trump tends to use it and how it was used, at least in this day one of the convention. For Trump, there's a couple of ways in which he uses fight. When he's trying to be sort of the most presidential that he can be, it's usually fighting on behalf of others, right? Fighting on behalf of the forgotten Americans, for instance, right? The deeper he got into his presidency, the much more common version of fight that we have come to associate with Donald Trump is fight for me, right? The election was stolen. We have to fight to get it back. If you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. It's fighting on his behalf. The way, at least for now, the Democrats are using fight in the convention, still tends to be that kind of first version of fight. Like, we're fighting on behalf of the middle class, which is always great because everyone thinks they're middle class, right? So we're fighting on behalf of the middle class. We're fighting on behalf of, people who can't fight for themselves. It tends to mean a sort of more benevolent version of fight, but fight is still aggressive, right? Fight is still meant to connote toughness. And here I don't mean to like psychoanalyze this too much, but to the extent that the image that Trump is always trying to project is one of toughness, certainly getting up and yelling fight right after the assassination attempt, um, supported that image. It may be the Democrats, want to show that they are also fighters.
Mhm.
And so, but yes, I was struck along with you
Yeah.
at the recurrence of that word.
I was just listening to Carville and Bagala talk about how in '92 they realized that they had to put George H.W. Bush on the defensive. Otherwise, they'd be answering questions about Bill Clinton's behavior the entire time. And
Mm.
and they make a very strong kind of punch them in the mouth before they punch you kind of argument. I wondered if that was in there somewhere. We're going to take a quick break. We'll have just a little bit of time on the other side. And so much I want to talk to Carlos Lozada about. So we'll come right back. And time to thank Eugene Amatruda, the Jedi Master. He is our technical producer today. Lily Tyson is the senior producer of the Colin McEnroe Show. She produced this particular episode with Carlos Lozada. Carlos Lozada's new book is the Washington book, How to Read Politics and Politicians. He received the Pulitzer Prize for Criticism in 2019. And Carlos, I want to talk just a little bit. I've become quite a fan of Matter of Opinion. This is a podcast, a roundtable style podcast in which New York Times opinion writers, it's a slightly kind of ever shuffling group, but there are some core people in it, talk about a particular issue. And I just want to say, first of all, that it makes me feel better about America sometimes when I listen to it. The most recent one you did, which is about the whole idea of having kids becoming a political issue, it's just, and I've interviewed Ross Douthat. I think his wife listens to my show on a pretty regular basis too. Just listening to you guys have what appears to be kind of a collegial set of exchanges. There's a friendliness. You don't all agree about stuff. You seem to be able to get past that. And I don't know. I mean, I grew up on James Reston and Tom Wicker, and I didn't really know very much about, how they sounded when they were being informal. I maybe you could just say a little bit about that, what you see as the purpose of it and the value of it.
Well, I'm glad you brought it up. It's not something I came to the New York Times planning to do. I joined the Times a couple of years ago after many years at the Washington Post, and I went mainly to write the kind of pieces that we're talking about it, trying to understand politics through books. And so this was something that started shortly after I got there. The idea was to have a collection of columnists. The main regulars are Ross Douthat, Michelle Cottle, Lydia Polgreen, and me, covering the issues of the day. And I've enjoyed it thoroughly. We all come from somewhat different political persuasions, but just different interests, right? Different ways of seeing the world that don't always have to break down according to political affiliations. And so we tackle, sometimes it's something very newsy, like Donald Trump's speech at the convention. We sort of do that immediately after it's done. Or sometimes we cover sort of big cultural thematic questions. And I think part of the appeal of the show is precisely what you've outlined, that we can have these conversations, even if we come to them from very different persuasions, in a way that's collegial, in part because we're colleagues, but it's not like we were, I didn't really know any of them before I joined the Times in 2022. And so it's just a weekly conversation where we sort of sharpen each other's thoughts, where we find points of tangency and connection, points of difference. And I've enjoyed it quite a bit. Also, being a columnist at a place like the Times and at other news outlets as well can be a little isolating. You're off doing your own thing.
Yeah.
You work with your editor, you write your columns, but it's not necessarily a huge community. This podcast has become my community at the New York Times. And what surprises me is, I've been I've been traveling some, talking about this book, going to book festivals and to universities. And often someone will come to the book talk, and then they'll come up to me at the end and say like, "Oh, I'm a huge fan. I listen to you every week." Right. And it's not that I'm a huge fan. I loved your column on X, or I loved your first book, or no, it's like I listen to you every week. There's a real intimacy, as you know, of course, to radio, to audio, to podcasts. People feel like they know you when they are with you day to day or week to week.
Absolutely. I really want to recommend to people that they listen to, I think it's still the most recent episode, 2024, is Suddenly About Having Kids. Why? And particularly, I mean, we were going to play a clip from it, but we don't have time. But at the end, you talk about your sister, as you did here on the show today. And then you have this little thing you say about marriage at the end that is so beautiful. I think everybody who listened to it, it's a little bit derived from Good Will Hunting, but it's so beautifully done that, I mean, I think everybody who listened to it got choked up. Hey, we've got 2 minutes left, so let's just talk about one word that you might be ready to retire. We did a show back in the spring about the term vibes and what it meant.
Oh, you did?
Yes,
okay.
We're going to redo it, I think, or update it or something. But I know you've begun to think that it's become a catch-all term that's more confusing than useful in certain ways. But yeah, give us like 60 seconds on vibes.
Yeah, well, I have to go listen to your episode now, which I missed. Yes, I had a road trip back from our annual beach vacation a week or so ago, and so I listened to hours worth of podcasts, and I was shocked by how often the explanation for all sorts of complicated questions of policy and polling and politics and culture was just reduced to vibes, right? And sometimes vibes, to the extent that they mean what, feelings, sort of generic views, right? I suppose that can be useful. But I think it's often code for we don't know, so we're going to call it vibes, right? This is the vibes economy, or it's the vibe. I mean, it just gets used so much that I've started to question its utility. And now you are inspiring me to maybe write a column of the case against vibes.
Right. I would track
yeah.
I track Nate Silver in 538 on this. I know he's not there anymore, but I think Silver used to use it very disparagingly, because he values data, not vibes. But I think he kind of seduced them, and they've started to use it. A lot of the data people, it's like the stuff we can't quantify, but we kind of intuit is true.
Right. Vibes is this residual category, right? It's what the data doesn't show, so you sort of attribute it to vibes, as opposed to thinking maybe we're asking the wrong questions or collecting the wrong data.
Right. Lily tells me we did our original episode in November of 2022, so don't listen to that one. We're going to update it. We'll let you know when we got one that's worth you listening to. But meanwhile, Carlos Lozada, what a lot of fun. I had so many other things I wanted to talk about, but great to have you visit us again. The Matter of Opinion podcast. The book is The Washington Book, How to Read Politics and Politicians, and obviously read the Carlos Lozada columns in the New York Times. Thanks to you all for listening. We will be back tomorrow with the proverbial more.
I repeat in the night. Must be an ending to it all. But hold on, it won't be long. Just